Hello, nice to meet you. I'm analyzing chapter 8 from the book written by Edward Hall. The author of the book, Edward Hall, describes the question of context in this chapter. The title of this chapter is Why Context? The author explains why context is important in life and in learning and understanding languages and cultures. In the beginning, he says that context makes it possible for human beings to perform the exceedingly important function of automatically correcting for distortions or omissions of information in messages. It's an interesting fact that firstly this question was investigated by psychologist, zoologist Rosalind Warren and his scientific team. Warren made the experiment with replacing some sounds of the word by cough. He eliminated one sound, then one syllable in words. Subjects listening to the tape for the first time were unable to detect the excisions and still actually heard the missing sounds. In the end of his experiment, Warren states that verbal context can determine completely the synthesis of illusory speech sounds. Phonemic restorations are heard when the context is clear, but part of the stimulus is absent. On the other hand, when the stimulus is clear and the context is absent, the situation is opposite. When a single word without context is repeated over a 3-minute period, the same word after a time is no longer heard as the same word, but several different words. The author gives the example of the word dress, which was repeated without pause and heard distinctly, and was soon transformed into dress, stress, joys, floris, florist, and purse. Then the author of the book describes the more recent study of perception made by Johnson and McClellan. It says that subjects can perceive and identify a particular letter as a part of the word more accurately than they can if the letter by itself. Another aspect of context is closely connected with the nervous system and the sensory receptors, particularly the eyes and the ears. It appears that one of the principal consequences of neocortex, the new brain that man can detect and work with patterns, to a greater degree than other forms. This is not intelligence as it is measured by educators or psychologists, by even more basic skill needed by all normal people, says the author. Another quote is, "If human beings were unable to detect and work with patterns, it is doubtful if complex life could have evolved." After all these statements, author gives the opposite example of lower organisms on the phylogenetic scale than man, which are fooled by mimicry opposing the context. Mimicry in nature is discussed according to examples of tastes, smells, compensatory capacity of insects, frogs and their food, and also with other examples. Then some other statements from zoology are given. According to Goras and Bishop, studies mentioned in the chapter, the differences between various vertebrate retinas, the ganglion cells, are not due to new types of synapses, but different proportions. And so on this region, higher vertebrates gain the advantage of extracting more features from the external world. Moreover, man's visual apparatus enables him to see in many different ways. Then the descriptions and explanation of this phenomenon is given. This is important survival mechanism which enable primitive man to detect danger on either side, and it's still important in driving cars, for example, and also at night when one navigates almost entirely by context. Peripheral vision also enables us to find and then fixate with the fovea even very small objects such as tiny airplane in the sky. All the scientific facts mentioned above and other one given further prove the biological and zoological aspects of humans' ability of the acquiring life in context, and the importance of this fact in studying languages and cultures. After the description of human visual system, the various taxonomies, such as folk taxonomics and scientific taxonomies, are discussed. It's stated that modern classification methods provide man with a lot of information that is difficult to integrate to a usable, intelligible pattern. The question is how classification systems are relevant to the subjects of this chapter. The answer is that classification system is an excellent example of how the majority of Western people have been trained to think. Further, the author gives lots of critical remarks on the ways of thinking in business, government, science, and education. He says that all these institutions should be experts in high-context integrative systems and in putting things together, and also in observations, but they are not so. He gives them a piece of advice: not only learn how to integrate the two or more systems of observations, but have a courage to underwrite contextual thinking and contextual research. It is also said that to be a recognized high context thinker, one has to be an Einstein or an Albert Szent-Györgyi. Novelist Szent-Györgyi classifies two types of thinking according to an old Greek system: Apollonian, which tend to develop established lines to perfection. Here we can speak about low context. And Dionysian, which is more apt to open new lines of research and can be referred to high context. Then he says that the future of mankind depends upon the progress of science, and the progress of science depends on the support which mostly takes the form of grants. Thus, applying for grants begins with writing a project. The Apollonian clearly sees the future lines of the research and gets support in distributing grants. On the other hand, a Dionysian scientist must be deeply contexted in his work before he even writes a proposal. Szent-Györgyi tells us that in order to get research grants, he had to lie about what he intended to do. Then he describes a discovery how it must be, at variance with existing knowledge. He states that the essence of living substance is uncertainty, and the essence of a research too. Then the author gives the analysis of the researches about man's behavior made by Watson and Skinner, in which these scientists say that everything that man does is determined by his environment. Other scientists oppose this opinion and state that this one is very narrow because it reduces behavior to one set of explanations. As a result of a spoken analysis and observations, the author makes the conclusion that high-context people can be creative within their own system, but have trouble with anything new. whereas low context people can be quite creative when dealing with the new and have trouble within the old systems. Then he says that it is easier to foresee trouble or coming confrontations in low context cultures than high context cultures because the bonds that tie people together are fragile. But in the high context culture, the situation is the opposite. According to the anthropologist Francis Hsu and others, because the bonds between people are so strong, there is a tendency to allow for considerable bending of a system. So there is a danger that the West faces in its dealing with East. When the low person interacts with a high context culture and doesn't even think about all the differences and doesn't try to foresee all contingencies, he's headed for trouble. While there is a significant difference, one can only guess what the total implications are. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.